We have been listening to President Trump giving remarks in Poland. Matthew Kroenig is standing by. We've been talking a little bit earlier about some of the remarks that the president said a little bit earlier. Matthew, you are a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and you're a professor at Georgetown University. So we've heard the official speech from the president in front of a warm, loud crowd. They were chanting his name. What stood out to you about his speech?
Well, I think it was a very strong speech, perhaps his best foreign policy speech so far. First, it was scripted. This is a president who sometimes goes off script, but it seems like he stuck to the script here. Second, he showed a deep appreciation for Polish history. Probably half the speech was about Polish history, the Soviet and Nazi Germany occupation, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And so I think that probably resonated with Poles who also have a deep sense of their history. And then third, coming to the policy issues, I think he hit all the right notes. Called out Russia, really, in his strongest terms yet, talking about Russian destabilizing activities in Ukraine and Syria and elsewhere, and gave really full-throated defense of NATO and of U.S. commitment to NATO and to Article 5. So again, I think he hit all the right notes, perhaps his best foreign policy speech so far.
Yeah, you mentioned Article 5, and that the president received at least a bit of criticism the last time he made a speech in front of NATO members. Many people were hoping for a full-throated endorsement of Article 5, and they never really got it. And later on, Sean Spicer, press secretary, basically said, well, the fact that he showed up at the meeting is enough to tell you that he's endorsing NATO and endorsing Article 5. What you heard in his speech, do you think that's strong enough to at least put some people at ease?
I think so. He said that Europe should have no doubt, that Europe has no doubt, that the United States stands strongly behind its Article 5 commitments. Earlier in the speech, he said that U.S.-European relations have never been stronger. I think some people might disagree with that, but I think, again, that's strong words of support. And, you know, one other thing that's interesting is I was in Europe the last time he was there and gave his speech where the support for Article 5 was maybe a little weaker. And many of the European officials I talked to said that behind the scenes, the administration is doing a lot of the right things. Strong outreach from Mattis, McMaster, Tillerson, an increase in spending for this European reassurance initiative. So the actions were there, but the words maybe weren't. Here, I think the actions and the words are lining up.
So shortly he'll be moving on to Germany. He'll be going to Hamburg. And aside from the G20 meeting, there will be a series of bilateral meetings. He's going to start with the German Chancellor Angela Merkel. He's also going to meet with the leader of China as well. Let's start with Angela Merkel. What is the expectation what do you think will be discussed? What's going to be the priority between these two leaders?
Yeah. Well, they've gotten off on probably on the wrong foot. You know, climate change is something that's very important to Prime Minister Merkel. President Trump has withdrawn from this Paris climate change agreement, so Merkel's not happy about that. Merkel also a strong supporter of free trade. The president has raised questions about the value of free trade, so I suspect that those will be two issues front and center. But, you know, there's also a lot of facts just pushing the United States and Germany together. Shared interest in combating threats to Europe and Russia, shared interest in combating terrorism, big trade and financial ties between the United States and Germany. So I suspect that the relations between Trump and Merkel will improve just because the interests in having better relations between the United States and Germany are so strong.
And President Xi Jinping, that's bound to be a very interesting meeting. We have a lot going on. Obviously, the president unhappy with how China has been dealing with North Korea, tweeting out his unhappiness before he left on his trip. America applying more sanctions to Chinese banks. If you could be a fly on the wall, what do you think you'd be hearing in those meetings?
Well, those will be more difficult meetings, I suspect. You know, the president said a lot of tough things about China on the campaign trail. And then when he came into office, he decided he was going to try to cooperate with China to get help on North Korea. And then it seems like now the administration is tacking back and getting tougher again with China. As you point out, secondary sanctions on Chinese firms and banks for not doing enough to try to help with North Korea. But the United States also agreed to sell arms to Taiwan, something that's always been a point of contention between the United States and China. And the United States has picked up its patrols in the South China Sea, these freedom of navigation operations. So I think there are many areas of tension on the bilateral agenda between the United States and China, and I think those are the issues they'll discuss: South China Sea, Taiwan, North Korea.
Now, the main event obviously will be the president having his first face-to-face meeting with President Vladimir Putin. But I want to ask you another question about Germany and China. There has been a lot of talk now about the Trump agenda, the America First philosophy, and that if America is going to be pulling itself back from the world stage in terms of influence, there will be a vacuum and someone needs to fill it. Do you also expect during this G20 meeting that we will see, whether it's Germany or China, pushing, jockeying, trying to figure out an angle to fill what some say will be a void?
Yeah, I think you've seen some signs in this direction. China, in particular, has, I think, tried to step up and play more of a leadership role. But it's really somewhat disingenuous. You know, that President Xi gave a big speech at Davos earlier this year or last year talking about the importance of free trade. And China's certainly engaged in the international economy, but they really have more mercantilistic economic policies. A lot of state support for their industries, a lot of restrictions for foreign businesses doing business in China. So a little bit disingenuous there. And then also on climate, President Xi, after the United States withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement, the Chinese talked about the importance of addressing climate issues. But again, you know, China is the largest polluter on Earth. And even according to the Paris Agreement, they won't start cutting back their greenhouse gas emissions for several decades into the future, I think 2030. So I think China's trying to play this role, but it'll be difficult given their policies. And Germany is, you know, the largest economy in Europe, will continue to be a leader in Europe. But I hope that that leadership is with the United States, not separate.
All right, let's move on to Vladimir Putin. This is bound to be a very interesting meeting. Twice today, while in Poland, the president addressed the destabilizing activities of Russia and working with Poland and the other nations to counteract the destabilizing activities. He talked about hammering out an energy deal with Poland so they will no longer be held hostage by a single supplier of energy. Presumably, he's talking about Russia, who supplies a lot of energy to a number of nations there and can basically set the price. Ukraine found themselves in that predicament as well, I believe. Yet there is this sort of chummy feeling about the relationship between Vladimir Putin and the president. The president has praised Vladimir Putin. You know how it goes. He's been criticized for his lack of desire to be particularly critical. And he even expressed earlier this morning when he spoke a little bit of doubt as to whether or not Russia was involved in meddling in the 2016 election. He said, yeah, you know, maybe Russia may have been involved, but perhaps other countries, almost sort of normalizing the activity, if you will. When we know, Matt, that a number of American intelligence agencies have all concluded, they all agree that Russia did meddle in the election. It seems like two different people talking when we listen to Donald Trump talk about Russia.
Yeah, you know, I worked in the intelligence community in the past, and it's difficult to get even individual analysts in the intelligence community to agree. So getting multiple intelligence agencies to agree on something is quite significant. I have no doubts, personally, that Russia meddled in the election. You know, Trump's desire to improve relations with Russia is not that unusual. Barack Obama, George Bush came into office wanting to do something similar, but Trump's comments about Russia have been very sympathetic, but then behind the scenes he's doing a lot of things that you know, aren't really what Russia would want to see. He shot down or conducted the strikes against Syria, a Russian ally. He's increased defense spending for NATO. He's allowed Montenegro, another European country, into Europe. So there's always been something of a mismatch there between his actual policies and what he's been saying on Russia. Today, probably his toughest language on Russia to date. So I think this is perhaps the most important one-on-one meeting the president will have with a world leader. What is this meeting with Putin going to look like? And what will the terms of U.S.-Russia relations going forward look like? Because I think there's no doubt that it would be great if the United States and Russia could have better relations. But the cause of the downturn in relations in recent years is really the responsibility falls on Putin's shoulders. So I think the United States and NATO needs to stand firm, and it's up to Putin to decide whether he wants better relations, which would mean stopping his destabilizing activities.
So what do you think the goal of their talks will be? Is there a plan? You know, you talk about the policy, and one of the things that is sort of the hallmark of the Trump administration is that in many areas the policy is often unclear. Yes.
You know, it's interesting because when you talk to people in the administration, as I do, they say that there is serious policy reviews going on, close interagency coordination. But then, I think the messaging part is where they have some trouble and aren't always consistent. And so what we hope to get out of this meeting with Putin today is, I agree with you, it's not very clear. But I think if we can take what the president said in his speech today at its value, that issues like Ukraine, like Russian support for Syria and Iran, will be some of the issues that come up. The United States wants to defend NATO, defend its European partners. We would like to cooperate with Russia to get some kind of peace agreement in Syria that both defeats ISIS, but also gets kind of some stable government there. So there are some common interests, but also some areas of disagreement. And so I think all of those issues are going to come up today.
You know, when I've heard people talk about Vladimir Putin, there's often a lot of talk about how prepared he is, how studied up he is when he meets with other leaders. I heard a story about him bringing a dog when he met with Angela Merkel because he had learned that she didn't like dogs, or that he's strategically late to meetings with world leaders as a way to sort of throw them off. And President Trump is sort of known in a way for the opposite. I mean, we applaud him when he sticks to the speech and doesn't go off script. He's known for being a little more casual in his dialogue and interactions and operating from his gut. It seems like these two leaders have drastically different styles.
Yeah, I think they do have drastically different styles, and the outcome of these meetings can be quite significant. You know, you might think, well, it's just a short meeting, but you think back historically to the meeting between Kennedy and Khrushchev. Short meeting, but Khrushchev really sized Kennedy up in that meeting, thought that Kennedy was unprepared, was young, that he could push him around. And many people think it was that meeting that led directly to the Cuban Missile Crisis, that Khrushchev thought that he could get away with putting nuclear missiles in Cuba because Kennedy seemed weak. So I think the meeting between Trump and Putin will be quite significant. What do these two leaders make of each other? And does President Trump come off as strong and willing to defend his partners in Europe?
Yeah, I know for sure, for one thing for sure, rather, is that everyone's going to be watching that handshake really, really closely.
Yeah, well, there was the handshake with Trump and Macron that maybe you're referring to, where
Yes.
they're really gripping each other pretty hard. Macron later said that was no accident. Yeah, we'll have to get some body language experts in to analyze the handshake between Trump and Putin.
Yeah, definitely. So beyond that, though, this is a meeting of the G20, though, the 19 nations plus the EU, and there will be some important issues on the table. What topics do you think will be driving the conversation within the larger group?
Yeah. Well, the host nation really plays a large role in terms of setting the agenda. So this one will be in Hamburg, Germany. So Angela Merkel is, the host of the event, and she has said that the two issues she wants to discuss are climate change and also the global economy, which is often a subject, of course, for the G20, but in particular the importance of maintaining free trade, of not returning to a more protectionist type of international economy. And so I think those will be the two biggest issues on the agenda. What is the future of climate change? What is the future of this Paris Agreement? And then also, what's the future of trade between the G20 nations, the largest 20 economies on Earth? Combined, these 20 nations make up about 85% of world GDP. I think something like 2/3 of the world's population. So much of the world economy and world population is going to be represented in this meeting today.
You know, the other major topic of conversation that's on the board has to do with North Korea. It may have not been at the top of the agenda prior to the 4th of July weekend, but Kim Jong-un certainly made sure that he was on the minds of many of the world leaders. This morning, when asked about North Korea, the president said that there would certainly be severe consequences, but he wasn't willing to say what they might be, what the options might be. And then he sort of pivoted and talked about, you know, he's not going to announce a red line like President Obama did, and kind of like began to talk about Syria. But, you know, what could these severe consequences be? We talked a little bit earlier about a military option, but how realistic is a military option when we're dealing with a world leader who doesn't seem to, quite frankly, scare easily?
Yes. Well, you know, as we talked about earlier, we really have no good options. I suspect, therefore, that the most likely option going forward will be something like the status quo, continuing to take steps to defend ourselves and our allies, continuing to take steps to try to increase pressure on North Korea. But there are military options, I'm sure, that are being considered. One, as I mentioned before, would be to not allow North Korea to conduct future tests. You know, the United States does have the ability to conduct strikes against these missile tests to essentially destroy the missiles on the launch pad in North Korea before they could be launched. So that would be one way to prevent North Korea from conducting these tests. But you'd be talking about a strike on the North Korean territory. And so I think North Korea could be justified to respond militarily to that. Has a lot of artillery on the border with Seoul, so could cause a lot of damage and destruction to America's allies in Seoul and to U.S. forces there. And there would be other larger military options as well. You know, I'm sure the United States and South Korea have planned for larger operations. What if North Korea collapses? So I'm sure we have bigger kind of regime change plans. But those are all so risky for the reasons I pointed out. I suspect we'll see something like the status quo plus.
Yeah, it certainly seems like the Trump administration policy is sort of working out to be more of the same. I just want to remind people of what we're seeing right here. This is Air Force One in Warsaw, Poland, preparing to take off and head to Germany for a meeting of the G20 nations. The president's second trip overseas started in Poland, where he just wrapped up a speech. He also spoke earlier alongside the Polish president. He received a warm welcome in this country, as was expected. The Polish government, very similar to in many ways to the Trump administration in terms of their philosophy. The Polish government coming in on a wave of populism and also anti-immigration sentiment as well. And so he was received well in Poland. You could hear a pretty large crowd chanting his name, and he's heading off to what is expected to be much tougher circumstances at the G20. So Matt, just continuing this conversation about North Korea, which is certainly going to be at the top of the agenda. You were talking earlier about China. The president will be meeting with Xi Jinping today as well. And over again, we hear China, North Korea is almost completely dependent on China. And China has done some things. They've scaled back in terms of, I believe, selling coal to North Korea and has tried to apply some pressure. But I've heard a couple of theories as to why China won't apply enough pressure to destabilize North Korea. One, that they are concerned about a possible humanitarian crisis, that if North Korea becomes completely destabilized, they'll have to deal with a rush of refugees coming over the border, and it's just something they don't want to have to deal with. Two, that they're concerned that if they destabilize North Korea, what they will create is an opening for the U.S. to have a larger footprint in that area, which is something they definitely do not want. What do you think is stopping China?
Well, I think you hit it on the head. You know, China would prefer that North Korea not have these nuclear and missile programs. I think on that, the United States and China agree. The problem is priorities. For the United States, the nuclear and missile program is priority number one. For China, it's priority 3 or 4. As you point out, priorities number 1 and 2 are preventing the collapse of the country and a refugee crisis into China, which would not only be a humanitarian disaster, but also be economically challenging for China to handle. And then second, they do like having a buffer state between themselves and U.S. ally South Korea and U.S. forces in South Korea. So they want North Korea to continue to exist. And so that's why we see Chinese behavior of putting a little bit of pressure on North Korea, but not too much. And so I think it's going to be unlikely that the Chinese government's going to decide to put enough pressure on North Korea to force North Korea to give up this program. And so I think some of these latest moves towards secondary sanctions might have more of a chance of success because they really rely on the business, kind of rational business decisions of these Chinese banks and Chinese firms. Do you want to have continued access to U.S. markets, to the dollar, to the international financial system, which is largely dominated by the United States? Or do you want to make money on this cross-border trade with North Korea? And at least some of them, I think, will decide they want access to the international financial system and cut off trade with North Korea. But relying on the Chinese government is going to be, I think, disappointing in the end for all the reasons you mentioned.
Matthew Kroenig, thank you so much for joining us early in the morning and sharing some of your insights. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.